Perhaps we should have the Astropathicus provide us with one of their primary class adepts, said Voke from behind me. I don't think there's a mind block there at all, I said. You would see traces of the conditioning. He'd most likely be screaming for us to stop now because he knows he cannot tell us the answer.
Nonsense, whispered Shongard. No raw mind could withstand this.
I sometimes doubt whether my fellows know anything about human nature at all, I said mildly. This man is a fiend. This man is nobility. He has seen into the darkness we so fear, and he knows what power feels like. The promise of what lies at stake for him and his collaborators is enough to steel him. I crossed to the table and looked down into Glor's lidless eyes. Blood bubbled at his flayed lips as he smiled at me. He promised the overthrow of worlds, the annihilation of billions. He boasted of it. What the Glors are after is so great that none of this matters. Isn't that right, Uracell? He gurgled. This is just a hardship, I said, turning away from the heretic in disdain. He keeps going because he knows that what awaits him will make this all worthwhile. Vogue snorted. What could be so?
Eisenhorn sounds convincing to me, said Endor. Glor will protect his secrets no matter what we do, for those secrets will repay him 1,000-fold.
Shongard's masked face shook dubiously.
I am with Brother Vogue. What reward could be worth the prolonged ministrations of the Inquisition's finest fleshsmiths?
I didn't answer. I didn't know the answer, in truth. But I had some notion of the scale, and the thought of it froze my soul. If I had harbored any doubts that the Glor's authority had survived, they were dispelled in the course of the next week. Campaigns of explosive, toxic, and psychic sabotage plagued the worlds of the subsector, as if all the secret dark cells of evil hidden away within imperial society were revealing themselves, risking discovery as they turned on their local populations, as if orchestrated by some ruling power. The likes of Lord Glor and his accomplices had either escaped destruction or they were but part of an invisible ruling elite that now mobilized all the hidden offspring cabals on a double dozen worlds into revolt.
There is another explanation,
Titus Endor said to me as we attended Mass in the Imperial Cathedral of Dorsey.
For all their power and influence, the Glors were not the summit of their conspiratorial pyramid. There were yet others above them.
It was possible, but I had seen the Glor's arrogance firsthand. They were not ones to bow to another master, not a human master anyway. The unrest had broken out on Gudrun too by then. A bombing campaign had stricken one town in the south, and an agricultural settlement in the west had been exterminated by a neural toxin released into its water supply. Battlefleet Scarus was still struggling to recover from the self-inflicted blow against it, and Admiral Spatian had returned from his mission to reassemble the panic fleet units empty-handed. Captain Estrom's mobile group had simply vanished. I had exchanged messages with Madathene, who told me that no one in Battlefleet Command now doubted that the destruction of the Ultima Victrix and the subsequent mayhem had been anything other than sabotage. Our enemy's reach extended into the Battlefleet itself. Then 2 massive hives of Thracian Primaris rose in open revolt. Thousands of workers, tainted by the corrupt touch of chaos, took to the streets, burning, looting, and executing. They displayed the obscene badges of chaos openly. The Lord Militant's plans for a crusade into the Ophidian subsector were now indefinitely postponed. Battlefleet Scarus left anchor and made best speed to suppress the Thracian uprising. But that was only the first. Open revolt exploded throughout the suburbs of Sameter's capital city, and, a day later, a civil war erupted on Hesperus. In both cases, the stain of chaos was there. This miserable, shocking period is referred to in imperial histories as the Helican Schism. It lasted 8 months, and millions died in open warfare across those 3 worlds, not to mention hundreds of lesser incidents on other planets, including Gudrun. The Lord Militant got his holy crusade, though I am sure he hardly expected to be waging it against the population of his own subsector. The authorities, and even my worthy fellow inquisitors, seemed stunned to the point of inactivity by this unprecedented outbreak. The arch-enemy of mankind often acted openly and brutally, but this seemed to defy logic. Why, after what may have been centuries of careful, secret establishment, Had the hidden cults risen as one, exposing themselves to the wrath of the Imperial military? I believe the answer was the true matter. Uracil Glor's almost gleeful resistance to our methods convinced me. The arch-enemy was embarked upon something so momentous that it was prepared to sacrifice all of its secret forces throughout the subsector to keep the Imperium occupied. I believed, with all conviction, that it would be better for planets to burn than for that true matter to be accomplished, which is why I went to Damask. Chapter 13. Damask. North Quam. Sanctum. Under a leaden, rusty sky, the ball-tree forests followed the wind. They looked like thick herds of bulbous livestock surging across the rolling sweeps of scree, and the jostling, clattering noise they made sounded like hooves. But there were trees, pustular, fronded globes of cellulose, swelled by lighter-than-air gases generated from decomposition processes deep inside them. They drifted in the wind and dragged heavy, trailing root systems behind them. Occasionally, the pressure of one ball tree against another caused a gas globe to vent with a moaning squeal forced out through fibrous sphincters. Plumes of gas wafted above the tree herd. I climbed to the top of a low plateau, where the bluish flint and gravel were caked in yellowish lichens. A couple of solitary ball trees, small juveniles, scudded across the hill's flat summit. In the center of the plateau's top stood a rockcrete pylon marker, commemorating the original landing place of the first settlers who had come to Damask. The elements had all but worn away the inscription. Standing by the marker, I slowly turned and took in the landscape. Black flint hills to the west, thick ball-tree forests in the wide river valley to the north, leagues of thornwoods to the east, near to where we had set down, and grumbling fire-topped volcanoes to the south, far away, sooting the sky with threads of sulphurous brown smoke. Clouds of small air grazers circled over the forests, preparing to roost for the night. A surly, scarred moon was rising, distorted by the thick amber atmosphere. "Eisenhorn," Midas called over the vox. I walked back down the plateau slope, buttoning my leather coat against the evening breeze. Midas and Fishig waited by the landspeeder that they had spent the past 2 hours unstowing and reassembling from the gun-cutter's hold. It was an old, unarmed model, and it hadn't been used for 3 years. Midas was closing an engine cowling. "You got it working, then?" I said. Midas shrugged. "It's a piece of crap. I had to get Euclid to strip in new relays. All manner of cabling had perished." Fishig looked particularly unimpressed with the vehicle. I seldom had a use for it. On most worlds, local transport was available. I hadn't expected Damask to be so unpopulated. Records said there were at least 5 colony settlements, but there had been no sign of any from orbit, and no response to vox or astropathical messages. Had the human population of Damask withered and died in the past 5 years since records were filed? We'd left Amos, Bequin, and Loink with the cutter, which had put down on the shores of a wide river basin. We'd carefully disguised it with camouflage netting. Midas had chosen a landing site within speeder range of some of the colony locations, yet far enough out to avoid being seen by anybody at those locations as we made descent. Tobias Maxilla awaited our pleasure aboard the SN in high orbit above. Midas fired up the speeder's misfiring engines, and we moved off overland from the hidden cutter towards the last recorded position of the closest human settlement. Tumblebrush scudded around the speeder, and we rode through scarpland where root-anchored trees spread aloft branches blistering with gas sacs, so that the whole planet seemed to strain against the soil and gravity in the wind. Grazers, little bat-like mammals with membranous wings, fluttered around. Larger gliders, immense headless creatures that were all flat wingspan and fluked tail, turned silently on the thermals high above us. The landscape was jagged, broken, and had the bluish cast of flint. The air was dark and noxious, and we used rebreather masks from time to time. We followed the frothy, brackish river waters for 20 kilometers, and then left the wide flood banks and judded up through rocky scarps, sculptural deserts formed by elementally shattered flint outcrops, breaks of dusty yellow fern, and seas of lichen trembling in the gusting wind. The ugly moon rose higher, though there was still daylight left. Midas had to slew the speeder to a halt at one place where a group of much larger grazers broke across the trail, panicked by the sound of the engines. They were dove-grey giants with steep, humped backs, trunk-like snouts and long, attenuated legs, ending in massive pads. Their legs seemed too slender and long to support such bulks, but like the local plant life, I suspected the swollen torsos of these animals contained supporting bladders of gas. They snorted and clattered away into the fern thickets. The speeder had stalled. Midas got out and cussed at the rotors of the turbofan for a few minutes until the mechanism chuckled back into life. As we waited, Fishig and I stretched our legs. He climbed up onto an igneous boulder and fiddled with the straps of his rebreather as he watched the hot blue streaks of a meteor storm slice the gloomy sky on the western horizon. I gazed across the fern thickets. Air grazers chirruped and darted in the hushing leaves. The wind had changed, and a forest herd of ball trees scudded in through the edges of the ferns, squeaking and rasping as the wind drove their globes and root systems through the grounded plants. We pushed on another 10 kilometers, coming down into a rift valley where the ground became thick sedimentary soil, black and wet. The vegetation here was richer and more rubbery. Bulb snakelocks and bright, spiky marsh lilies, club moss, horsetail, tousled maidenhair, lofty cycads festooned with epiphytic bromeliads, and skeins of ground-draping netophytes. Clouds of tiny insects billowed in the damper glades and along seeping watercourses, and large hornet-like hunters with scintillating wings buzzed through the damp air like jeweled daggers. "There," said Fishig, his eyes sharp. We stopped and dismounted. A muddy expanse near the track had once been a cultivated field, and the rusty carcasses of 2 tilling machines lay half buried in the sucking soil. A little further on, we passed a marker stone struck from flint. Gillen's Acre, it read, in low Gothic. We'd passed the township itself before we realized, and turned back. It was nothing but the stumps of a few walls covered with wispy weed growth and rampant netophytes. Until at least 5 years before, this had been a community of 800. A scan showed metal fragments and portions of broken machinery buried under the soil. Fishig found the marker screened by sticky cycads at the north end of the town plot. It had been fashioned from local fiberwood, a carved symbol that was unmistakably one of the filthy and unnerving glyphs of chaos. A statement? A warning? Fishig wondered aloud. "Burn it immediately," I told him. The Vox link warbled. It was Maxilla from orbit. "I've been sectioning the landscape as you requested, Inquisitor," he reported. "The atmosphere is hindering my scans, but I'm getting there. I just ran a sweep of the volcanic region south of you. It's hard to tell because it's active, but I think there are signs of structures and operating machines." He pinpointed the site of the speeder's navigation system. Another 70 kilometers, roughly the location of another possible settlement listed on our maps. "That's quite a distance, and the light is failing," Midas said. "Let's get back to the cutter. We'll head south at dawn." In the night, as we slept, something approached the shrouded cutter and set off the motion alarms. We went out armed to look for intruders, but there was no sign. And no sign of drifting ball trees either. At dawn, we headed south. The volcanic region, its smouldering peaks rising before us, was thickly forested with fern and thorn scrub. It was hot, too, as stinking, heated gas leaked into the glades from the volcanic vents that laced the rocky earth. A half hour into the sulphurous forests, we were sweating heavily and using our rebreathers almost constantly. Below the peak of one of the largest cones, the land speeder's rudimentary scanners detected signs of activity as we rode up a long slope of tumbled, desiccated rock. Fishig, Midas, and I dismounted from the speeder and clambered up a flinty outcrop to get a better view with our scopes. In the shadow of the cone was a large settlement. Old stone and wood-built structures, mostly ruined, as well as newer, modular habitats made of ceramite. There was machinery down there, generators and other heavy systems at work under tarpaulin canopies. Tall, angled screens of reinforced flakboard had been erected on scaffolding rigs to shield the place from ashfall. 3 speeders and 2 heavy 8-wheelers were drawn up outside the main habitat units. A few figures moved around the place, too distant to resolve clearly. "The last survey showed no signs of active volcanism in this region," Midas reminded me, echoing an observation Amos had made on our arrival. "See there," I said. indicating a portion of the settlement that ran into the slope of the largest cone. Those old buildings are partially buried in solidified ash. The original settlement predates the activity. Midas pulled a map slate from his pocket and whirred through the index.
North Quam, he said. One of the settler habitats. A mining town.
We watched for 15 or 20 minutes, long enough to feel the ground shudder and see a gout of white-hot liquid fire spit from one of the cones. Alarms sounded in the settlement below, but were quickly stifled. A rain of wet ash and glowing embers fluttered down across the township and settled like black snow on the flakboard screens.
Why would they persist in working this site with the constant threat of eruption?
Fishig growled. Let's take a closer look, I suggested. Covering the speeder with foliage, we set off down the forested valley. The ground between the feathery ferns and hard, dry thorn trees was thick with fungal growth, some of it brightly covered and glossy. Though we worked carefully, we couldn't help kicking up puffs of spores and ceridia. I was wearing my button-sleeve black coat, Fishig his brown body armor, his helmet hooked on his belt, and Midas wore his regular outfit, though he had replaced his cerise jacket with a short, dark blue work coat. All of us melted into the forest shadows. I still wasn't sure why Fishig had come along. After Gudrun, the remit given him by Lord Custodian Carpel seemed done with, but he had refused to return to Hubris. It seemed he trusted my instinct that the matter was far from done with. We crossed a low stream bed, steaming with hot, pungent water that bubbled up from the vents, and came silently up along the north edge of the settlement. Now the judder of generators could be made out, the distant growl of rock drills. Guards in khaki drill fatigues, worn under spiked and blackened segments of metal body armor, wandered the length of an earthwork wall that had been banked up at the edge of the trees, running great bull cygnets on long chains. The canines were meaty brutes with lolling tongues and beards of spittle. The guards that pulled on their chains carried newly stamped short-form lasguns on shoulder slings. Their faces were masked behind heavy black rebreathers. Work gangs, some stripped to their leggings in the heat, toiled to sluice the smouldering ash from the flakboard screens with hoses and bucket chains. Midas pointed out where the edges of the settlement had been ringed with motion detectors and anti-personnel mines. All had been deactivated. The constant tremors had rendered both useless as defenses. But there was no mistaking the aura I had felt since we had first begun to approach. A psychic veil utterly enclosed North Quam. I took out my scope and played it around the settlement. More guards, many more, and dozens of filth-caked workers, lounging by the entrance to one particularly large modular shed. Several supervisors moved back and forth among the resting work gangs, holding brief conversations and making notations on data slates. 8 workers emerged from the shed carrying long, stretcher-like trays with high sides covered with clear plastic wraps. I zoomed the magnification of the scope to get a closer look at the faces of the supervisors. I didn't recognize any of them. They were all dour, scholarly men in grey, rainproof overalls. Something vast suddenly crossed my field of vision. By the time I had reacted and adjusted the magnification, it had passed out of sight into the work shed. I had a brief memory of bright, almost gaudy metal and a shimmering, flowing robe.
What the hell was that?
I hissed. Midas looked at me, lowering his scope, actual fear on his face. Fishig also looked disturbed.
A giant. A horned giant in jeweled metal, Midas said. He came striding out of the modular hab to the left and went straight into the shed. God Emperor, but it was huge.
Fishig agreed with a nod.
A monster,
he said. The cones above roared again, and a rain of withering ash fluttered down across the settlement. We shrank back into the thorn trees. Guard activity seemed to increase.
Rosethorn,
my Vox piped.
Now is not a good time,
I hissed. It was Maxilla. He sent one final word and cut off. Sanctum. Sanctum was a glossier code word that I had given Maxilla before we had left the SN. I wanted him in close orbit, providing us with extraction cover and overhead sensor advantages, but knew that he would have to melt away the moment any other traffic entered the system. Sanctum meant that he had detected a ship or ships emerging from the immaterium into real space, and was withdrawing to a concealment orbit behind the local star, which meant that all of us on the planet were on our own. Midas caught my sleeve and pointed down at the settlement. The giant had reappeared and stood in plain view at the mouth of the shed. He was well over 2 meters tall, wrapped in a cloak that seemed to be made of smoke and silk, and his ornately decorated armor and horned helmet were a shocking mixture of chased gold, acidic yellow, glossy purple, and the red of fresh, oxygenated blood. In his ancient armor, the monster looked like he had stood immobile in that spot for 1,000 years. Just a glance at him inspired terror and revulsion, involuntary feelings of dread that I could barely repress. A space marine, from the corrupted and damned Adeptus Astartes. A Chaos Marine. Chapter 14. A Tale of Repression. Rogue. Return to the Flame Hills. "We've not been idle," Beckwin told me with a smirk when we returned to the gun cutter. It was noon, and the river basin was filling with bumping clusters of ball trees driven off the flint plains by the wind. They drifted over the shingle and splashed trailing roots into the water. Beckwin was dressed in work fatigues, a rebreather slung around her neck, and she carried an auto pistol. As Midas and Fishig stowed the speeder under the netting, she led me into the crew bay and waved the weapon in the direction of a thin, filthy man chained to a cargo loop with cuff restraints. His hair was matted, and his clothes, an assemblage of patched rags, were stiff with caked mud. He looked at me with fierce eyes through a shaggy fringe of wet hair. "There were 3 of them, maybe more," Beckwin told me. "Came to take a look at us, using the ball trees as moving cover. The others fled, but I brought him down." "How?" I asked. She gave me that look, which told me not to keep underestimating her. "Our intruders from last night?" I wondered aloud. Beckwin shrugged. I walked over to face the captive. "What's your name?" "He doesn't say much," Beckwin advised. I told her to move away. "Name?" I asked again. Nothing. I paused, collected my mind, and then sent a gentle probe into the shady recesses of his skull. "Thomas Rizzo," he stammered. Good. Another gentle push at his slowly yielding mind. The levels of fear and caution were palpable. "Of Gillen's Acre. Godesland." I switched to speech, without the psychic urge now. "Gillen's Acre? You mean Gillen's Acre?" "Say the Gillen his acre." "Gillen's Acre?" He nodded. "These the truth." "Proto-Gothic, with generational nuance shift," Amos said, coming near. "Damask was colonized something over 500 years ago, and was isolated for a lengthy period. The population may not have flourished, but the language has perpetuated vestiges of older lingua forms." "So this man is likely to be a native? A settler?" Amos nodded. I saw our captive was looking from my face to Amos's, trying to follow our conversation. "You were born here, on Damask?" He frowned. "Born here?" "I am of Gillen his acre. Yet be goddess land afore the working." I looked round at Amos. This would take forever. "I can manage," Amos said. "Ask away." "Ask him what happened to Gillen's acre." "Prithee, how can be lossen Gillen his acre?" His story was painfully simple, and shaped by the ignorance of a man whose kind had worked the poor soil of a lonely edgeworld for generations. The families, as he called them, presumably the clan groups of the original settlers, had worked the land for as long as his memory and the memory of his elders went. There were 5 farming communities and 2 quarries or mines, which provided building materials and fossil fuel in exchange for a share of the crops. They were devout people, dedicated to the nurture of Goddess Land, God's land, though there was no doubt that by God they meant the God Emperor. As little as 4 years ago, after the time of the last survey from which records we worked, there had been upwards of 9,000 settlers living in the communities of Damask. Then the mission came. Rizal reckoned this to have been 3 years before. A ship brought a small order of ecclesiarchs here from Messina. They intended to establish a retreat and spiritually educate the neglected settlers. There had been 30 priests. He recognized the name Datso. "Archpriest Datso," he called him. Other off-worlders came too, not priests like Datso and his brethren, but men who worked with them. From the way he described them, they sounded like geological surveyors or mining engineers. They concentrated their attentions on the quarries at North Quam. After about a year, the activity increased. More ships came and went. Settlers, mostly strong males, were recruited from the farm communities to work the mines, often brutally. The ecclesiarchs didn't seem to mind. As their populations drained, the farming settlements began to fail and die off. No help was given to sustain them. A disease, probably an off-world import, killed many. Then the volcanic activity began, suddenly, without warning. Everyone in the farmsteads was rounded up and pressed into service at the pits, as if some great urgency was now driving the task. Reiser and many like him toiled until they dropped, and later managed to escape, living like animals in the thorn forests. So Datso and his mission had come to Damask, enslaved the population into a workforce, and were now hell-bent on mining out something from the territory around North Quam. It seemed likely to me that the volcanism had been triggered by incautious mining work. I reached into his mind again. He trembled in fear as he felt the psychic touch, and showed him an image of Datso. Eagerly, he confirmed his identity. Then, Locke, another face he knew, and regarded with ill-concealed hatred. Locke had been chief among the men who had pressed the farmers into service. His cruelty had left a lasting mark. I showed him the faces of Uracel and Oberon Glor, neither of which were known to him. At last, I visualized an image of the pipe-smoking man. "Malahite," he announced, recognizing him at once. According to Rizor, the obscura addict with the watery blue eyes was Girolamo Malahite, chief of the surveyors and engineers. Fishig, who had joined us during the conversation, asked about the fiberwood marker we had found at Gillen's Acre. Rizor wrinkled his face with grief. That had marked the mass grave where the off-worlders had buried all those who had resisted. Midas called me to the cockpit. I told Amos to feed Rizor and question him further. Midas sat in the leather pilot's throne, his lap draped with spools of scroll papers stamped out of the electric press.
"No wonder Maxilla hid," he said by way of an opening. "Look here."
The scrolls were a transcription log of the astropathic and vox traffic Midas had been able to monitor from the ships in orbit. He slid a gloved finger down the jumbled columns of figures and text.
"I make out at least 12 vessels up there, maybe more. It's difficult to say an accurate figure. These here, for example, may be 2 ships in dialogue or the same ship repeating itself."
Coding?
"That's the interesting bit. It's all standard Imperial, the Navy code called Techcept."
"That's common enough." He nodded.
"And look here. The question and answer pattern indicates a capital ship checking that its fleet components have all arrived in real space. It's a typical Imperial structure. Military. One of ours.
A friendly fleet.
Not friendly, perhaps. Look at the command identifier here. That name translates as Estrom."
The missing captain.
"The missing captain. Perhaps not that missing after all. Perhaps rogue. The whole incident at Gudrun Anchorage, the mistaken recognition, the panic, could have been an excuse to withdraw ships loyal to him.
But he's still broadcasting in standard Imperial code form.
If his officers alone are party to the deceit, he won't want to alert the crews."
An hour later, a large launch with fighter escort broke from the fleet and swung down to the surface of Damask. The transport set down at North Quam, and the fighters circled the area twice before returning to their base ship. From the cutter we could hear the booming roar of their thrusters rolling around the plateau and valleys. Midas quickly switched the cutter's systems to minimum operation so they wouldn't make a chance detection of our instrumentation. Amos talked with Rizor for most of the afternoon, and he seemed calmer and more willing to help once food had been given to him. As the light began to fail and evening approached, Amos came to find me.
"If you want a way back in, that man might be able to help you."
"Go on."
"He knows the mines and the excavations. He worked there for a goodly while. I've spoken to him at length, and he seems certain he could show you to a cave network that links with the mining structure."
We set out after dark in the speeder. Fishig drove, using the terrain scanner to see, rather than the lamps. That made progress slower but more discreet. I sat next to him, and Bequin rode in the back with Rizor. There had been some debate about which of us should go, but I had made the final selection. The speeder could hold 4, and though Midas was the most able combatant in my group, more able than even the Chastener, in my view, I wanted him at the helm of the cutter, ready to respond. Besides, Beckwin had uses of her own that I considered vital to our endeavor. It took a long time to make the trek back to the North Quam region, and we didn't arrive until well into the second half of the night. Clouds had masked the sky, hiding the moon and stars, and the only light was the flare of the volcanic hills, underlighting the low clouds with a fluctuating red haze. The air was thick with sulphurous smoke. We left the speeder concealed in a hollow, its position flagged by a marker tag, and headed west around the outreaches of the area, the Flame Hills, as Reiser called them. Nocturnal creatures chattered and fluted in the darkness. Something larger and more distant howled. Pressing through the thorn scrub, we became aware of the harsh artificial lighting bathing the entire settlement. The volcanoes rumbled. It took Reiser a little time to find what he was looking for, a series of small shadow pools, half filled with geothermally heated water. The syrupy surfaces of the pools seethed and bubbled, and the site was plagued with insects drawn by the heat. Reiser splashed cautiously into the largest pool and worked his way around a massive boulder that was swathed in bright orange lichen. Behind it, masked by thorn and cycad, was a narrow cavity. This, he said, as best as I could understand him, was the route by which he had escaped from the slave gangs. We checked weapons and equipment and prepared to enter. I had opened the weapons locker on the cutter and provided us with as much efficient firepower as we could comfortably manage. I had my power sword, an auto pistol in a rig under my coat, and a las carbine with a lamp pack taped under the muzzle. Other items of equipment filled the pack on my back. Beckwin had kept her auto pistol and taken a flat-bladed knife, and she, too, had a lamp. I'd given Fishig an old but well-maintained heavy stubber, which seemed to please him enormously. He had his RBT's pistol and a satchel full of spare ammo drums for the stubber. Reiser had refused a weapon. I was certain he would leave us once we were safely en route anyway. The cavity allowed us to enter single file. I led the way, with Reiser behind me, then Beckwin, and Fishig brought up the rear. It was damnably hot in the narrow rock passage, and the sulphurous gases forced us to wear our rebreathers. Reiser had no breather, but tied a swathe of cloth around his nose and mouth. This was the practice the slaves had used when working the mines. The passage wound back and forth, and climbed for a while as it coiled into the hill. In places, it was so steep we had to climb up the ragged floor of the burrow. Twice we had to remove our equipment packs to ease through constricted sections. After an hour, I began to feel the oppressive throb of the psychic veil shrouding North Quam. As we penetrated it, I listened out for the sound of alarms or activity, but none came. Though she didn't know it, Beckwin was already doing her job by creating a dead spot that allowed us to press on invisibly. I made sure none of us strayed too far from her aura of influence. The lava flues were crawling with life forms adjusted to existence in the hot, chemical-rich environment. Blind, toad-like hunters, transparent beetles, albino mollusks, and spiders that looked like they were fashioned from white gold. A fat, pallid centipede as long as my arm spurred its way over the baked rock at one junction. Every few minutes the earth trembled. Loose rock and dust showered down from the roof, and warm, reeking gases blew back along the winding rock halls. The passage widened and showed signs of excavation. Thornwood props supported the ceiling, and marker boards with numbers chalked on them were nailed to every sixth post. Reiser tried to explain where we were. He did his best, and I was able to ascertain we were in a section of mine that had been worked and then abandoned. He said other things, too, but the meaning was beyond me. He led us to the end of one working, a low, propped tunnel, and I shone my light into a cavity that had been dug out of the loose shale and grit. Beckwin knelt and brushed grit off the floor with her hand. She exposed old tiles made of a dull metallic substance I couldn't identify. The tiles were perfectly fitted, despite the fact that they were irregular octagons. They were strangely unsymmetrical, with some edges overlong. Yet they all fitted almost seamlessly. We could not begin to account for it, and the pattern they made was intensely uncomfortable. At the rear of the cavity, ancient stonework had been exposed. I was no expert, but the stone, a hard, pale material glittering with flecks of mica, didn't look local. There was evidence that parts of it had been cut away with rock drills and cutting beams. "This is old," said Fishig. He ran his hand across the riven stone facing. "But the damage is new." "The wheel graves,"
Elizabeth Beckwin said suddenly. I looked over at her. On Bonaventure, she explained, remembering her homeworld. There were famous old sites in the western hills, made by races before man. They were arranged in radiating circles like wheels. I used to go there when I was a child. They had been decorated once, I suppose, but the surfaces had been cut away, ransacked by later hands. It reminds me of this. There are many who make a trade in archaeological plunder, said Fishig, and if it's Xenos artifacts, the penalty is high. I'd overheard Glor and his allies mention archaeo-xenon materials. If this was such a site, connected in some way to the as-yet mysterious Saruthi, it accounted for the way they persisted in working it despite the volcano. What had they taken from here? What was it worth to them? What was it worth to the Saruthi? We retraced our steps back to the main seam, passing 3 more abandoned cavities. Each one had shown signs of the old stonework, and each had been robbed like the first. We came to the end of the seam, and a metal ladder rose up through scaffolding to an opening in the rock 10 meters up. We climbed up into another tunnel, and at once heard the rattle of rock drills. The atmosphere was clearer here, and we were able to remove our rebreathers. Cold air, from the surface, I guessed, breezed down the tunnel. With extreme caution, we passed along, crossing the mouth of a gigantic cavern that had probably been a magmatic reservoir. The walls were polished and fused by heat. Crouching low, we looked in, and saw work gangs of men and women, undoubtedly Riser's kinfolk, forming basket chains to clear rock debris from the workface. There were at least a dozen of the bestial guards in their black, spiked armor. One walked the work line and administered encouragement with an electro-lash. I peered in more intently and tried to make sense of the main working. 2 Damaskite slaves worked with rock drills, cutting back the crust of wall, exposing a wide stretch of the old stone facing. Other slaves, most of them women, labored closely on the exposed section with small picks, awls, and brushes, revealing carvings of intricate design. A relay of shouts ran down the guard line, and we hid ourselves in the tunnel shadows. From up ahead, lamps bobbed and wove, and a party of men came down the tunnel from the surface into the cavern. 3 were guards, 2 grey-shrouded supervisors with data slates. The others were Gorgon Locke and the pipe smoker, Girolamo Malahite. As I suspected, members of the Glor cabal had escaped House Glor alive. Estrom's rogue fleet had no doubt played a part in that salvation. Locke was dressed in a leather robe with armoured panels woven into it. His mouth still showed the wound I had inflicted there. His mood was sullen. Malahite was dressed in black, as I had seen him before. He stood, studying data slates, conferring with the dig supervisors and the leader of the guard team before moving to look at the exposed stretch of archaeo-xenon material. The slave workers shrank back out of his way. He exchanged a few words with the men around him, and the guard leader hurried off, returning with a bulky rock saw. The tool trailed cables and tubes behind it, back to a socket junction at the mouth of the cavern, where it linked to a system of power and water supply lines running back up the tunnel to the generators and pumps at the surface. The saw whined into life, pumping a sheen of water over its blade to keep it clean and cool. The guard leader carefully sliced the blade into the rock, the saw keening as it bit. In a few seconds he had cut a slice of the carvings free. As far as I could tell, the carvings were made on individual stone blocks, and he was slicing the sculpted faces off the stones. He cut 2 more, and they were passed with reverence to Malahite, who studied them and then handed them on to be wrapped in plastic and placed in wooden carriers. The slices looked very much like the old stone tablets I had seen in that private study under House Glor. There was a loud crack. The guard leader had cut another tablet away, but it had broken into fragments. He dropped the saw and began to collect up the fragments frantically as those around him cursed and shouted. Locke moved in. He kicked the man hard and dropped him to the ground, then kicked him repeatedly as he lay there, trying to shield his face, begging for mercy. Malahite gathered up the fragments.
"You were told to be careful, you useless bastard,"
Locke was growling.
"It can be repaired,"
Malahite told the shipmaster.
"I can fuse it together."
Locke wasn't listening. He kicked the man again, then dragged him up and threw him against the wall. He cursed at him some more, and the man whimpered, pleading apologies. Locke turned away from the battered wretch. Then he picked up the revving saw, swung back, and dismembered the guard leader.
It was inhuman. The agonized screams filled the chamber. All the slaves wailed and moaned, and even the guards looked away in distaste. Locke laid in with murderous glee, covering himself in blood. Then he tossed the smoking saw onto the ground at his feet and turned to another of the guards. He pointed to the saw. "Make sure you do a better job," he snarled. With huge reluctance, the guard picked up the saw and set to work. Locke, Malahite, and their party left after another 10 minutes, followed by a work gang carrying the wooden crates full of cut tablets. We waited a few minutes, then followed them up the tunnel. There was daylight ahead, scarce and thin. The tunnel came up into what I had guessed was the large modular shed I had seen from my reconnaissance. Workers milled around on rest breaks, and guards and the grey-robed overseers wandered back and forth. Dig equipment and tools were piled up in the poorly lit shed. Fishig found a door at the back of the shed, behind equipment boxes, and broke the lock. The four of us were able to slip out of the shed from the rear into the settlement, without having to pass through the main mine entrance and thus be seen. We were now in a back lane of North Quam, with the volcano slopes behind us. Rotting and abandoned buildings stood close all around, and flurries of ash and soot blew down over us. We kept close to the walls, holding back out of sight when anybody passed. Behind the next jumble of ruins lay a cleared area, partly masked by more flakboard screens, designed to keep the ash out. 2 launches sat on the scorched ground, a large Imperial Navy transport and a smaller, older shuttle. A thicker layer of ash coated the older shuttle's hull. Figures moved around the entry ramps of both ships. Guards and workers were moving the wooden stretchers of excavated artifacts up into the belly hold of the Navy launch. I could see Locke and Malahite standing nearby, with several of the supervisors and 3 battlefleet officers in shipboard fatigues. One, a lean man with a receding chin and bulging eyes, wore the ribbons and insignia of a captain. Our rogue, Estrom. As I watched, the ecclesiarch Datso emerged from a nearby building and crossed to them, holding the hem of his rich gown up out of the ash. Shouting suddenly boomed across the yard, an angry human voice, followed by a deeper, more savage sound that set the hairs on my neck up. Lord Oberon Glor, dressed in a cloak and body armor, slammed out of the building Datso had emerged from, striding across the landing yard. A second later, the huge, ghastly bulk of the Chaos Space Marine followed him, raging and cursing. Glor wheeled and faced the giant monster, resuming his argument at the top of his voice. For all his size, the Lord of House Glor was dwarfed by the vividly armored blasphemy. The traitor Marine had removed his helmet. His face was a white, powdered, lifeless mask of hate, with smears of gold dust and purple skin paint around the hollow eyes, and a dry, lipless mouth full of pearl-inlaid teeth. His only vaguely human face seemed to have been sutured onto his skull, the exposed parts of which were machined gold. There was a terrible stink of cloying perfume and organic corruption. I could not imagine the courage or insanity that it took to face down a Chaos Space Marine in a furious argument. The wind was against us, and all we could hear was the violent snarl of the voices instead of actual words. Datso and Malahite quickly crossed to Glor's side, and most of the other guards and workers present cowered back. The wind changed a little.
"Will not deny me any longer, you human filth!"
The awful voice of the traitor Marine could suddenly be heard. "You will show me respect, Mandragore! Respect!" Glor yelled back, his voice powerful but seemingly frail against the roar of the Chaos Warrior. The Marine bellowed something else that ended in,
"Slay you all, and finish this work myself. My masters await, and they await the perfect completion of this task. They will not idle their time while you vermin dawdle and slacken. You will abide by our pact. You will keep to our agreement."
I realized I had almost become hypnotized. Staring at the monstrous, raging figure, drawn to him by his power and sheer horror, my eyes had lingered too long on the obscene runic carvings that edged the joints of his armor, the insane sigils that decorated his chestplate. I was entranced, captivated by the golden chains that dressed his luridly painted armor, the gems and exquisite filigree covering his armor plate, the translucent silk of his cloak, and the words, the alien, abominable words inscribed upon his form, twitching and seething with secrets older than time, secrets, promises, lies. I forced myself not to look, Soul-destroying madness lay in the marks and brands of chaos if one looked too long. Mandragore shrieked in fury and raised a massive gloved fist, spiked with rusty blades, to smash Lord Glor. The blow didn't fall. I started, as if slapped, as a burst of psychic power rippled across the concourse. Mandragore stepped back a pace. Datso moved towards him. Smaller than Glor or Locke, Datso seemed even more insignificant next to the monster, but with each step he took, the Chaos Marine moved backwards. He didn't speak, but I could hear his voice in my head. The presence and the words were so foul, I barely managed not to vomit.
Mandragore Carrion, son of Fulgrim, worthy of Slaanesh, champion of the Emperor's children, killer of the living, defiler of the dead, keeper of secrets, your presence here honors us, and we celebrate our pact with your fellowship. But you will not seek to harm us. Never raise your hand to us again. Never.
Datso was simply the most potent psyker I had ever encountered. With his mind alone, he had forced down one of the vilest of the traitors, a space marine sworn to the corrupt service of chaos. Mandragore turned away and strode off across the compound. I saw now how Lord Glor wilted from the confrontation, his bravado spent. Many of the workers present were weeping with the trauma of the exchange, and 2 of the guards were throwing up. Shaking, I looked round at my companions. Fishig was ashen-faced and trembling, his eyes closed. Rhizor had curled up in a ball in the ashy mud, his back against the wall. Bequin had vanished. Chapter 15. Exposed in the midst of the foe. An ill-matched war. Flight. I had a second to realize that wherever Bequin had gone, it had left us exposed, outside the veil of her untouchable aura. I heard a cry, a strangled warning from the old ecclesiarch that was immediately accompanied by the hoot of sirens. In the landing yard, guards were racing towards us. Datso was pointing directly at the section of ruin that concealed us. Locke pulled a las pistol from his robe. Angry voices, the raucous bark of cygnids. "Fishig!" I cried. "Fishig! Move or we're dead!" He blinked, still pale, as if he didn't recognize his own name. I slapped him hard around the side of his head. "Move, Chastener!" I yelled. The first of the guards had reached the ruins, and one was kicking his way in through a boarded-up door. I saw his staring face looking out of a dirty black visor. He raised his lasgun. I swung the powerful carbine up and laced him and the doorway with a spray of laser shots. Stone and wood debris spat and flew from the multiple impacts. Las shots whined in through gaps in the stonework and exploded against the outside wall. Fishig's heavy stubber chattered into life. He played the sweep of blazing tracer shots down the dark cavities of the ruin to our left, tearing apart 2 more guards who were forcing their way in. More guards to my right fired their weapons. My las carbine crackled on full auto, a blur of high-pitched whines, as I raked the narrow entrance and dropped another 3. Still firing, Fishig backed into the depths of the ruin. "Come on!" he snarled. I backed with him, our weapons laying down a storm of explosive metal and piercing energy that rippled across the ruin walls, scattering debris, spraying ash dust and bursting bodies. Rhizor, his mind utterly gone with terror, lay on the ground. I grabbed him by the scruff of his rags and dragged him after us. He fought at me, despairing. A large figure came leaping in through the window space in the wall, through which we had observed the dealings in the yard. It was Locke. He rolled as he landed, his las pistol retching shots. 1 shot clipped my left shoulder. Another 3 slammed into Rhizor's back, and he toppled into me, knocking me flat. Fishig saw Locke and swung round, his finger not lifting from the stubber's blunt trigger. The rapidly cycling mechanism of the heavy weapon made a high, grinding metallic noise, overlaid with the frenetic blasts of the shots. The scant cover around Locke disintegrated, and he cried out as he threw himself behind a section of wall. He fired as he moved, and Fishig grunted in pain as a las shot punched into his side. "Eisenhorn, you bastard!" Locke bellowed. I pulled myself out from under Rhizor's corpse, sad that the ragged slave had paid such a price for assisting an inquisitor. Another crime on the shoulders of Gorgon Locke. Damning the shipmaster's name, I pulled a frag grenade from my pack and tossed it in Locke's direction. Then Fishig and I moved as fast as we could out through the rear of the smoke-filled ruin. The grenade blew out the back of the structure. I hoped to the Emperor it had torn Locke limb from limb. Coughing and spitting, Fishig and I came out into a ditch that ran behind the ruined dwellings of North Quam and the newer modular buildings. Angled over us were the large flak-board baffles of the ash screens. Las shots chipped and whacked into the screens and wailed down the dim ditch. Guards tumbled into the ditch 20 meters away, rabidly howling cygnids, pouring in with them. Fishig made the ditch his killing field and emptied his second drum of ammunition down the length, pulverizing guard and canine alike. We hurried in the opposite direction as he struggled to clamp in a fresh drum. Guards were shooting at us through the ruins, blowing chunks from the mouldering stonework. We ran on, chased by the furious salvos. The ditch ran out into a small yard where an 8-wheeler truck was parked. We exchanged shots with 3 guards who rounded the corner into the yard and dropped them, but a 4th appeared, loosing a trio of cygnids from their leashes. Baying, they pounded across the yard. I killed one with my carbine, but the truck blocked any shots at the others. The big vehicle rocked as one leapt up onto its frame. A moment later, it was leaping over onto us. I put a las round through its skull as it came down, its muscled bulk just missing me. The other came out from under the truck, filthy with axle grease, and leapt at Fishig. It knocked him over, its huge jaws locked around his armored forearm. I drew my power sword and thrust the crackling blade through its body. More shots, thumping into the truck. "Get up," I told Fishig, as we rolled the canine's dead weight off him. The entire compound closing around us, we sprinted to the rear of a modular shed and broke the door in. It was an equipment store, stacked with spare blades for rock drills, spools of cable, lamp cells, and all manner of other mining equipment. We moved low between the piles of equipment, hearing shouts and running footsteps outside. I paused, changing cells in my carbine, and keyed my voxlink. "Thorn wishes Aegis, rapturous beasts below."
"Aegis arising, the colors of space," came the response immediately.
"Razor Delphus pathway," I instructed. "Pattern ivory."
"Pattern confirmed. N6. Aegis arising."
Guards burst into the back of the shed, and Fishig blew them back out through the prefab wall with a wild burst of shots. I looked around and saw a stack of black metal boxes raised on a pallet in the corner of the shed. The paper labels were old and faded, but I prized off the lid of one box and confirmed their contents. "Get ready to move," I said, arming my second grenade. "Oh, shit," said Fishig, seeing what I was doing. He was already half out the door as I placed the grenade on top of the boxes. We came out firing, met by a dozen or more guards who were sectioning the street looking for us. Most were pit guards in their black, ugly armor, but 3 were naval security troops in black cloth fatigues, no doubt part of the traitor captain's contingent. We fired as we ran. The grenade was on a 10-second fuse. The fact that we ran through the midst of them caught them unawares. None of them was able to get a clean shot off. Fishig and I dived headlong over a crumbling section of wall that had once surrounded North Quam's market yard. The grenade went off, and so did the stack of mining explosives it had been sitting on. The shockwave concussion flattened every wall for 30 meters. The upwards force of the blast, driving before it a blistering fireball, lifted the whole modular shed 20 meters into the air and sent the shredded remains of the structure crashing down onto neighboring buildings. Scraps of metal, cinders, and shreds of burning flakboard rained down on Fishig and myself. There was a dazed silence broken only by the warble of alarms, cries of the injured, and desperate shouting. The air was fogged by ash dust. Pulling on our rebreathers, we stumbled through the murk. I felt a jab of pain in my head. Deep, insidious burning. Datso was reaching out with his terrifyingly potent mind, looking for us. We stumbled through the smoke down an aisle between modular sheds whose windows had been blown out in the detonation. The pain grew more intense. "Eisenhorn, you cannot hide. Show yourself." I gasped as the pain took deeper hold. Suddenly, it eased. "Fishig, in here!" I pushed him into an old stone outbuilding. I guessed it had once been a washhouse in North Quam's more rural heyday. Bequin was cowering in a corner, filthy, tearful. The sight of the child of the Emperor Mandragore had sent her fleeing in blind panic. Like me, she had made the mistake of looking at the runes and marks on his foul, dazzling armor. Unlike me, she hadn't had the sense to look away. She couldn't speak. She barely registered us. But we were back inside her muzzling aura and out of Datso's clutches for the moment. "What now?" asked Fishig. "They'll regroup quickly enough." "Midas is coming. We have to get back to the landing yard. It's the only area big enough for him to set down in. Fishig looked at me as if I was mad. He's going to fly into this? He'll be killed. And even if he does pick us up, they'll launch interceptors from the fleet. They'll launch them the moment he powers up for takeoff. It'll be tight, I admitted. We dragged Beckwin with us and moved out of the derelict washhouse. Outside, the settlement was still swathed in ash lifted by the blast. Fierce fires glowed in the smoke. Voices screamed orders and cygnids bayed. There was a deeper, furious bellowing, too. I had a nasty feeling it was the Chaos Marine. Thorn attending Aegis, main yard area, I voxed.
Aegis, main yard in 3. The heavens falling.
So, they were onto him. The fleet had launched ships after the cutter. We ran now. The smoke was slowly clearing. A guard gang moved past us, and we were forced to double back around. More guards blocked the next street. Through the buildings, said Fishig. We were behind a modular building, one of the newest and largest that Datso's unholy mission had set up. There was no door, but we scrambled up onto the low roof, pulling Beckwin with us, and entered through a skylight. The room we dropped into was carpeted and well furnished, an office or private study for one of the senior supervisors. There were racks of data slates and piles of charts and storage tiles. Several large travel trunks had been piled in one corner, with a cloak and 2 overcoats draped over them. One of the new arrivals from the launch had left these things here and not yet unpacked them. "Come on," hissed Fishig, checking the door that led out of the office into the rest of the building. "Wait," I said. I cut the locks off the trunks with my power sword and threw the lids back. In the first, clothes, slates, a boxed lasgun, ornate and inlaid with the name Oberon. Other miscellaneous effects. "Come on," Fishig repeated, frantic.
Aegis, main yard in 2,
crackled the Vox. "Eisenhorn, what are you playing at?" Fishig demanded. "These are Glaw's things," I said, searching. "So what? What are you looking for?" "I don't know." I turned to the second trunk. More clothes, some crude and unpleasant religious icons. Fishig grabbed me by the shoulder. "With respect, Inquisitor, that would suggest this isn't the time to be doing it." "We have to get out of here. We have to get the hell out of here," Beckwin murmured, her eyes darting back and forth at every sound from outside. "There'll be something, an edge, a clue, something we can use when we get out of here. We'll be lucky to escape with our lives." "Yes," I stared up at him. "Yes, we will. And if we do, we'll want to continue our struggle against Glaw, won't we?" He threw his hands up in despair. "Please, please," Beckwin murmured.
Aegis, main yard in 1,
crackled the Vox. The third trunk, a wrapped set of stainless steel surgical tools whose purpose I didn't even want to imagine. A small dice and counter game in a hardwood box. Clothes. More damn clothes. With something solid wrapped in them. I took it out. "Satisfied?" asked Fishig. I would have smiled if Locke had left me able. "Go," I said. Beyond the stateroom was an outer annex. More luggage trunks stood on the grilled floor, as well as wooden boxes draped in plastic. "Don't even think about it," Fishig snapped, seeing me look at the trunks.
Aegis, on site.
The Vox burst was partly drowned out by the vibrating roar of a powerful aircraft passing low and fast overhead. There was a chatter of small arms, the whip of las rifles. I led the way out of the annex, through a hatchway that opened onto the landing yard. Figures milled around, mainly slave guards and naval troopers, looking skywards and firing at the looming gun cutter that banked overhead. On the far side of the yard, by the lowered ramp of the Navy launch, Malahite saw us and shouted out. The men swung around, firing. Shots crackled around us. Then I saw Mandragore, over to the right of the yard, charging towards us with a baleful howl. "Back inside! Inside!" I yelled, and the 3 of us tumbled back in through the door. The outer wall of the building didn't stop the Chaos Beast. Neither did the hatch. Ceramite and steel-shod fists tore the lightweight metal apart, twisted adamite support beams, punctured plastic panels like paper. Mandragore's baying wail preceded him, shaking us to the core. Beckwin screamed. The vilely misnamed child of the Emperor exploded through the end wall of the annex, white lips drawn back around pearl teeth as he hurled out noise from his augmented torso. The bolt gun in his fist was enormous. "Not a step closer!" I yelled. With one hand, I held the primed grenade up so he could see it. He laughed, a deep, booming chuckle of contempt. "I mean it," I added, and kicked the crate at my feet. It was laden with plastic-wrapped tablets from the mine. "1 second fuse.
Another step, and all this will be gone.
He faltered. Lord Glor and several guards appeared through the shredded wall behind him.
For pity's sake, do as he says, Glor barked.
With a growl, Mandragore lowered his bolt gun.
Back off, Glor. Back right off and take them with you. You can't hope to escape, Inquisitor, said Glor. Back off.
Glor waved his men back and retreated. Mandragore backed out slowly, a growling hiss rising from his throat.
Grab the crate,
I told Fischig. He slung his stubber over his shoulder and did as he was told. We edged out into the smoky daylight. Fischig and I were side by side, and I held the grenade over the crate he was carrying. Bequin cowered behind us. In the yard, Glor was ordering his men back. There were 40 or more troops, guards, naval troopers, supervisors. I saw Datso, Malahite, and the rogue Captain Estrom among them. Mandragore did not back off as far as the others. He stayed to the right of us, his shimmering cloak drifting in the breeze, his armor gleaming. The growl continued to purr in his throat.
Midas,
I said into my link. Set down. Hatch open.
Understood, he replied. Be advised there are 3 Navy interceptors inbound. Arrival in 3.
The gun cutter swung in over the yard, casting a wide shadow, its thrusters lifting clouds of ash. As it came into rest on its bulky hydraulic landing skids, the cargo ramp under the cockpit whined and lowered. Slowly we moved around until the cutter and the ramp were behind us. The assembled enemy watched us intently, weapons raised.
A standoff, Inquisitor, said Glor.
Get your men to lower their weapons, even the ones I can't see. Don't even consider dropping me. Midas, train the wing cannons on myself and the chastener. If anything happens to us, open fire.
Confirm.
The powerful cannons in the wing mounts traversed to target us.
Shoot us and the crate is vaporized. Weapons down,
Glor yelled, and the troops obeyed. Now call off those interceptors. Order them right back to their carrier.
Now!
Glor looked round at Estrom, who started to speak into a vox link.
The interceptors have aborted their run, Midas told me. They're turning back.
Very good, I told Glor.
What now?
He asked. What now, indeed? We had the upper hand for a moment. They didn't dare shoot or rush us, and Bequin was blocking Datso and any other psyker they had. An answer or two, I suggested.
Eisenhorn,
Fischig hissed.
An answer,
laughed Glor. Some of his men laughed too, and Mandragore rumbled a snigger. I noticed Datso and Malahite were both unamused. This material is archaeoxenon, from an old Ceruthi site, I said, lifting one of the ancient unsymmetrical tablets from the crate in Fischig's grasp with my free hand. It clearly has value to you, because it must have value to the Ceruthi. You're recovering it for them in return for what?
I'm not about to tell you anything, Glor said. I'm not even going to confirm your suppositions.
I shrugged. It was worth trying. My question remains, said Glor. What now?
We leave,
I told him. Unmolested. So leave, he said, with a mild, dismissive hand gesture. Put down the crate and leave. This crate is the only thing that's stopping you from obliterating us. It comes with us, as insurance.
No,
Datso cried, pushing forward.
Unacceptable. We would lose it forever.
He looked at Glor.
This man is our blood foe. We could never recover the artifacts. Even if we agreed to safe passage, he would not honor a deal and leave them for our recovery.
Of course not, I said. Just as you would not honor any deal struck with me. It is a sad but true fact that no commitment or agreement of honor can be made between us. Which is why this crate comes with me. We have no other surety.
We're not here to offer you surety, flesh blister,
Mandragore said sonorously.
Only death. Or, if you're unlucky, pain and death.
You should keep him out of the negotiations, I told Glor with a sideways nod at Mandragore. We are leaving with the crate, because you will destroy us otherwise. No, said Glor. He stepped forward, pulling a lasgun from his coat. You are tripping on your own smooth logic, Inquisitor. If we are to lose those artifacts forever, I'd rather it was here, with your deaths as consolation. If you try to leave with the crate, we will fire anyway, and damn the consequences. Set them down, and I will give you 10 heartbeats to leave. I could tell it was no bluff. They would only go so far to protect their trinkets. And they were not fools. They knew I would never return these items. 10 heartbeats. If we tried to board with the crate, they would fire at once. If we set it down, they would fire, but perhaps more hesitantly for fear of hitting the crate. And the cutter's guns were still a point in our favor.
Back up to the ramp.
I whispered to Beckwin and Fischig.
Throw the crate down when I say.
Are you sure?
Do as I say. Midas.
Ready drive. Ready cannons.
Now! The crate crashed over in the dust. The cutter's engines shrieked into power. They didn't wait 10 heartbeats. The three of us were on the ramp, and the ramp was swinging shut under us, and the cutter was lifting around us. A fusillade of weapons fire hammered off the hull. The cutter's cannons roared. The cutter swung hard about, and we tumbled as the deck pitched. Fischig cried out and fell on the ramp, spilling half out of the gently closing entryway. I grabbed him and hauled him inside before his dangling legs could be severed by the vicing ramp or shot by the enemy below. We were away. I could tell by the angle of the deck and the vibration of the ship's frame that Midas was accelerating hard and keeping low, letting the landscape shield us from the ground fire. Alarm lights flashed in the crew bay, indicating damage. "Strap yourself in!" I yelled at Amos, who was attempting to rise to assist us. "Fischig, get Beckwin in a harness! Yourself too!" The chastener pulled the terrified girl across the deck and into a seat. I clambered forward, along the companionway, and up into the cockpit. Midas was pulling on the controls, taking us higher. The blotchy landscape of Damask flickered past beneath us. I dropped into the seat beside him.
How close? The fighters have peeled back on a direct intercept course. They have altitude in their favor.
How close?
6 minutes to intercept. Damn!
What? He pointed to the main tactical screen. Behind the smaller bright cursors, larger shapes were moving against the three-dimensional magnetic map of the planet's magnetosphere.
Their fleet's moving too, the capital ships. And that's 2 more fighter wings launched. They don't want us to get away, do they?
He added. With what we know.
They won't let us out of the system alive, will they?
Midas, I think I've told you the answer to that. He grinned, white teeth contrasting sharply with his dark skin in the cabin's half-light.
We're going to have some fun then,
he decided. His bare hands, sparking with the inlay of Glavian biocircuits, darted across the controls, adjusting our course.
Ideas?
I asked.
A few possibles. Let me massage the data.
What?
Trust me, Gregor. If we've even a shred of hope of getting out of the Damask system alive, it'll be through skill and subtlety. Shut up and let me compute their speeds and intercept vectors.
We took damage from the ground fire, I persisted. That hopelessness was seeping into me again, the feeling of having no ability to influence the situation.
Minor, just minor,
he said distractedly.
The servitors have got it covered.
He made a course change. From the screen, I saw this brought us around almost side-on to the chasing fleet components, drastically reducing their time to intercept and firing range. What are you doing?
Playing the percentages. Playing safe.
The bright globe of Damask was dropping away beneath us, and we were driving out into planetary space beyond the highest orbit points at full thrust.
See?
He said. Another light had appeared on the tactical screen, moving around ahead of us.
Standard Imperial battle fleet dispersal. There's always a picket ship positioned on the blind side of the subject world. If we'd kept straight on, we'd have flown right into its fire field. Lights flashed out into the void beyond the cockpit windows. The picket ship, a medium frigate, was firing anyway, running interference, driving us on. "It's launched fighters," Midas reported in a sing-song voice. "Range in 2. Chasers have range in 4. So matter-of-fact. I looked at the power levels. Every one of the cutter's powerful thrusters was redlining. "Midas!
Midas!
Sit back. There it is."
What is? The small moon was suddenly filling our front ports as we veered around. It didn't look that small. It looked like we were about to smash into it. I blurted out a curse.
"Relax, damn it,"
he assured me, then added, "Range in 1. We dived towards the scarred, pocked lime-green rock that filled our vision at full thrust. Nose guns beginning to flash. 6 interceptors of the Battlefleet Scarus Elite Fighter School followed us in. Chapter 16. Void Duel. Betancourt's last stand. Traces. The moon was called Obol, the smallest and innermost of Damask's 14 satellites. It was a dented, irregular nugget of nickel, zinc, and selenium, 600 kilometers across at its widest dimension. Lacking atmosphere and riddled with cavities and gorges, it shone with a lambent green glow in the light of the star, rugged terrain features and craters thrown into stark relief. I was forcing my mind to calm, forcing my pulse rate down, the old mind skills Hapshant had trained me in. I focused on the data file for Obol that I had punched up on the screen. Nickel, zinc, selenium. Small list of 14, not because I wanted to know, but because the facts would act as psychopomps. Little fetishes of detail to occupy my mind and steal it away from the hazard. I looked up from the glowing text bar. A jagged crater, vast enough to swallow Dorsey City and its lagoon whole, yawned up at us.
Brace yourselves,
Midas told us all. Just a kilometer above, he executed his move. By then, we were deeply committed to Obol's gravity and diving at full thrust. There was no question of performing a landing, or even a conventional turn. But Midas had been flying ships since he was young, schooled in the pilot academies of Glavia. By way of his inlaid circuitry, he understood the nuances of flight, power, and maneuver better than me, and better than most professional pilots in the Imperium. He had also tested the capabilities of the gun cutter almost to destruction, and knew exactly what it could and couldn't do. What worried me most was what he hoped it might do. He cut the drive, fired all the landing thrusters, and pulled the nose around so that the cutter began to corkscrew. The view whirled before my eyes, and I was flung around in my harness. The spin seemed uncontrolled, but it was measured and perfect. With the landing jets driving us up away from the vertical, we fluttered like a leaf, using the corkscrew motion to rob the vessel of downward momentum. 90 meters from the dust of the crater floor, we flattened out, burning jets hard, white-hot, and then arced around as Midas cut the main drive in again. The ground leapt away under us, and we hugged across it, climbing in a savage jerk to skip over the crater lip. From the tactical display, I saw all 6 fighters had dropped back to 6 minutes behind us. None wanted to try duplicating that move. They were diving in more conventional, slower arcs. Midas hugged the moon, slicing us low around bluffs and butts, down deep dry valleys hidden from the sun, across wide dust plains that had never seen a footprint. At one point, we flew between 2 massive cliffs of striated rock.
They're breaking,
Midas said, leading us to port. They were. 4 dropped into dogged pursuit, chasing us low over the landscape. The other 2 had broken and were heading anti-clockwise around the blind side of Obol. Contact?
We'll meet them head-on in 8 minutes,
said Midas. He was smiling. He pulled a hard starboard turn down a rift valley the topographer screen had only just illuminated. Then he slowed down to what seemed a painful, easy velocity and banked the gun cutter around a butt that glistened green and yellow in the hard sunlight.
What are you doing? Wait.
The tactical screen showed that our 4 chasers had swept beyond the rift valley.
This low to the terrain, it'll take them a moment to figure out we're no longer ahead of them.
What now? He gunned the engines and threw us out over a dust bowl after the pursuit ships.
Mouse becomes cat,
he said. Within seconds, a bright blob on the weapons array had been covered with red crosshairs. Ahead of us, through a landscape of giant rocks and towering mesas that whipped by at a distressing speed, I saw the flare of afterburners.
Scratch 1,
said Midas, firing the wing cannons. The engine flare far ahead flashed, and then turned into an expanding ball of burning gases, which swept past us in jagged streaks. I was pulled back into my seat as we jinked painfully down another valley. There was another flash of sunlight off metal, a kilometer ahead.
And 2,
said Midas. The readout on the autoloaders notched up red tags as drums expended. The flash blossomed with light, and then again more brightly as it spun and struck the valley wall. Something blindingly brilliant went off to our right, and the cabin rocked, alarms squealing.
Smart boy, too close,
said Midas, hauling on the stick to avoid an incoming cliff. One of the fighters had gauged our feint and come around across us.
Where's the other?
Midas murmured. We had firepower on our side. Firepower and Midas. The fighters were lightnings, small, fast, and dexterous, less than a quarter our size. For all intents and purposes, the gun cutter was a transport, but its drive and weapons enhancement and its vertical thrust capability made it a formidable fighting ship when it came to a skirmish close down over terrain like this. Something hit us hard, and we went over in a dizzying fall. Midas cursed and drew us back round in a tight turn. An Imperial fighter, just a blur of silver, crossed our field of vision. Midas turned us again and went after it. It ducked and turned down the deep gorges of the moon, flying by instruments alone in the cold shadows. The gun sensors picked up its heat trail. Midas fired on it. He missed. It tried to turn in a loop to come round at us. Midas fired again. Another miss. It came right at us. I could see the tracer jewels of its shots ripping at us, head to head, in a steep, deep gorge. No room for maneuver. No room for error.
Goodbye,
said Midas, thumbing the fire stud. An explosion lit the deep gulf, and we flew right through the flame wash.
Had enough yet?
Midas asked me. I didn't reply. I was too busy gripping my armrests.
I have, he said. Time for phase 2. There's another hunter right around us, and the blindsiders will be coming up in 90 seconds. A little theatrics now. Euclid?
The chief servitor warbled a response. We went into a dive, hard. A display told me we were venting a trail of engine gases. Damage? I asked.
Play acting,
he told me. The dark canyon floor rushed up to meet us.
Jettison, Euclid,
Midas ordered. There was a thump and a bang. The cutter rocked. Behind us, something flared. What was that?
2 tons of spares, trash, and expendable supplies, plus all the grenades from your weapons store.
He banked us around hard, and we zoomed into a darker cavity, a wide, deep cave in the canyon base. The walls and roof seemed dangerously close. 600 meters into the cave, Midas turned the cutter to the left, cutting the thrust, floodlights piercing the gloom and reflecting off the jagged cavity. Another 100 meters, and we settled into the dust on our landing struts. Midas cut power, cut the lights, cut everything except the most rudimentary life support.
Nobody make a sound, he said.
The wait, which lasted for 66 hours, was neither comfortable nor pleasant. We wore heat gowns and sat in the gloom as, above us, the heretic fleet scoured Obol and its immediate zone for traces of us. 8 times in the first 10 hours our passive sensors registered vehicle movement and scanning in the gorge where we had faked our destruction. The deception was apparently convincing. But we bided our time. There was no telling how persistent they would be, or how patient. Midas thought it likely they might be playing the same trick as us, lying up quiet and waiting until we betrayed ourselves by movement or signal. After 40 hours, Loeing was confident he had overheard astropathic traffic exchanges indicating a fleet departure, shortly followed by a tremor in the fabric of the fathomless immaterium. But still we waited. Waited for the one thing I would take as convincing. Just after the turn of the 66th hour, it came. An astropathic signal in Glossia. Nunc dimittis. We lofted from the darkness of Obol into the starlight. Everyone on the ship, myself included, I freely admit, was suddenly talking too loud and too much as we moved around, basking in the bright cabin lights and the restored heating systems. The silent, cold wait had been like a penance. The SN, slow and majestic, moved in to meet us. Once the heretic fleet had left the system, Maxilla had emerged from hiding in the star's corona and sent his signal. As soon as we were docked, I went straight to the bridge where Maxilla greeted me like a brother. "Are we all alive?" he asked. "In one piece, though it was close. I'm sorry I had to desert you, but you saw the size of that battle group." I nodded. "I'm hoping you can tell me where it went." "Naturally," he replied. His astro-navigators had not been idle. The chief of them emerged from their annex at the side of the domed bridge and hummed across the red-black marble of the floor to join us. Like all of his crew, it was essentially mechanical. Its organic human component, my guess was no more than a brain and some key organs, supported both physically and biologically in a polished silver servitor sculpted in the form of a griffin, its draconian neck swept back so its beaked visage stared down at us. It floated on anti-grav plates built into its eagle wings. It paused before us and projected a holographic chart from its open beak. The star map was complex and incomprehensible to the unschooled eye, but I made out some detail. "The navigators have analyzed the warp wake of the departing fleet and made a number of algorithmic computations. The heretics are moving out of the Helican subsector, out of Imperial space itself, into the forbidden stellar territories of a breed I believe are known as the Saruthi." I had guessed as much, but that in itself is a considerable area, more than a dozen systems. We need specifics. "Here," said Maxilla, indicating a point on the shimmering three-dimensional chart with one gloved hand. "The charts have it as KCX 1288. Under optimal conditions, it's 30 weeks away from here."
"And what is the margin for error on this calculation?"
"No greater than .06.
The warp wake of the fleet was quite considerable. They may, of course, break the journey and reroute, but we will be watching for changes in their wake. Of course, he added, they will presume us to be following. Even if they think you're dead, they'll know you had to have had a starship that brought you here, one they couldn't find. The thought had crossed my mind, too. Glor and his conspirators must at least now be expecting pursuit, or expecting someone to inform on their whereabouts and destination. They would now be trusting on vigilance, their considerable massed firepower, and their head start. I already had Loink busy preparing an emergency communique to send back to Gudrun and Inquisition Command. "What do you know of the Saruthi and their territory?" "Nothing," he said. "I've never travelled there." I thought this a curiously brief answer for a man so usually talkative. "So," he said at length, "apart from our knowledge of where they're going, have we any other advantages?" "We have." I took from my coat pocket the item that had rested there ever since I had liberated it from Glor's travelling trunk in North Quam. Maxilla regarded it with frank perplexity. "This," I told him, "is the Pontius." We used a large empty hold in the depths of the SN. Some of Maxilla's servitors arranged lighting and power feeds. My own servitors, Modo and Nilquit, carried the claw-footed casket in and set it on the cold steel floor. I stood watching, my hands buried deep in my overcoat pockets against the cold of the chamber. Amos hunched over the casket and, with Nilquit's aid, began to connect cables. I looked over at Bequin. She stood next to Fishig, and was bundled up in a heavy red gown with a grey shawl, and there was an expression of grim reluctance on her face. She'd found it all fun at first, a game, even in the face of danger, at House Glor. But Damask had changed things for her. She knew it wasn't a game anymore. She'd seen things that many, perhaps even most, citizens of the Imperium never see. Most lives are spent on safe worlds far from the touch of war and horror, and the obscenities that lurk out there in the darkest parts of the void are myths or rumors, if that. But now she knew. Perhaps it had changed her mind. Perhaps she didn't want to be here any more. Perhaps she was now regretting jumping so eagerly for the offer I'd made her. I didn't ask her. She'd tell me if she had to. We were all too committed now. "Eisenhorn?" Amos reached out his hands, and I placed the cool, hard ball of the Pontius in them. With almost priestly care, he fitted it into place. I ordered everyone back out of the hold, even the servitors, everyone except Bequin and Amos. Fishig closed the hold door behind him. Amos looked at me, and I nodded assent. He made the final connection, and then backed away from the casket as hurriedly as his old and augmatized limbs could manage. At first, nothing. Small telltale lights winked along the edge of the casket, Iclone's casket, and the internal wiring glowed. Then I felt a change in air pressure. Bequin looked at me sharply, feeling it too. The metal walls of the hold began to sweat. Beads of moisture popped and dribbled down the wall plating. There was a faint crackling sound, like the gentle crisping of paper in flames. It spread, growing louder. Frost was forming on the casket, on the floor around it, spreading out across the hold's decking, up the walls, across the ceiling. A glittering thickness of diamond frost coated the interior of the hold in less than 10 seconds. Our breath steamed in the air, and we brushed jewels of ice dust off our clothes and eyelashes. "Pontius Glor," I said. There was no answer, but after a moment or two, a series of animal grunts and barks mewled from the vox speakers built into the casket. "Glor," I repeated.
"What?"
said an artificial voice. Bequin stiffened.
"What have you woken me to?"
"What is the last thing you remember, Glor?"
"Promises. Promises,"
the voice said, coming and going, as if drifting away from the microphone and then back.
"Where is Urusel?"
"What promises were made to you, Glor?"
"Life,"
it murmured.
"Where is Urusel?"
There was a tone now, an anger or an impatience.
"Where is he?"
I began to frame another question, but there was a sudden flash of activity, a crackle of electronic synapses firing across the crystal surface of the ball. It had lashed out with its mind, with its potent psychic powers. If Bequin had not been here, cancelling it out, no doubt Amos and I would have been dead. "Temper, temper," I said. I took a step towards the casket.
I am Eisenhorn, Imperial Inquisitor. You are my prisoner, and you only enjoy cognitive function because I allow it. You will answer my questions.
I will not.
I shrugged. Amos, disconnect this menace and prepare it for disintegration.
Wait.
The voice was pleading, despite its colorless artificiality. I knelt down in front of the casket. I know that your life and intellect were preserved in this device, Pontius Glor. I know you have waited for 2 centuries, trapped in a bodiless state, desperate to be made whole again. That is what your family promised you, wasn't it?
Uricel promised. He said it'd be so. The methods were prepared.
To sacrifice the nobility of hubris so that their life energies might be siphoned off into you through this casket. To give you the power to create a body for yourself.
He promised.
The stress fell on the second word, anguished and deep. Uricel and the others have abandoned you, Pontius. They abandoned the hubris project at the last minute in favor of something else. They are now all in the custody of the Inquisition.
No.
The word turned into a hiss that died away.
They would not.
I'm sure they wouldn't, unless it was something so vital, so unmissable that they had no choice. You'd know what that would be, would you? Silence. What would be more important to them than you, Pontius Glor? Silence. Pontius?
They are not caught.
What? Who are not?
My brethren, my kin. If you had them, you would not be asking these questions. They are free, and you are desperate.
Not at all. You know how it is. So many lies, so many conflicting stories. Your pitiful family trying to sell each other out in exchange for freedom. I came to you for the truth.
No. Credible, but no.
You know what it is, Pontius.
No.
You know what it is. They woke you from time to time to keep you informed, woke you from the oblivion that surrounds you in that globe. Beneath House Glor, for example, in that chapel they built to contain you. I saw you there. You subdued me with your power.
I would do so again,
It said, traces of fire once more flickering along the golden filaments and woven circuits that encase the jagged, quartz-like lump. You know what it is. They told you.
No.
I reached down and grasped a sheaf of wires. You're lying, I said, and yanked the wires out. A brief moan rolled from the Vox speakers and faded. The lights on the casket went out. Air temperature and pressure began to climb again. The frost began to dissolve. Not much, then, said Beckwin. We're just beginning, I replied. We've got 30 weeks. Chapter 17. Discourses. Speculation on an unsymmetrical theme. Betrayal. I went to the hold each day with Beckwin and Amos, and we repeated the procedure. For the next few days he refused even to answer. After about a week he began to goad us and abuse us with threats and obscenities. Every few days he tried to lash out psychically, thwarted each time by Beckwin's untouchable presence. All the while the SN plunged through the immaterium towards the distant star group. In the 4th week I changed tactics and entered into discussion with him on any subject that occurred to me. I didn't ask a single question concerning the true matter. He refused to engage for the first few days, but I remained cordial and greeted him patiently each session. At last, discourses began on astral navigation, high ecclesiarch music, architecture, stellar demographics, antique weapons, fine wines. He could not help himself. The isolation of his condition made him crave such contacts with a real, vibrant world. He longed to taste and read and see and live again. Within 2 weeks he needed no encouragement to talk. I was no friend, and he was still wary and keen to insult on any occasion, but he clearly welcomed our conversations. When, deliberately, I missed a day, he complained sullenly, as if wounded or let down. For my part, I had the chance to realize how dangerous Glor was. His mind was brilliant, charming, witty, incisive, and formidably knowledgeable. It was a pleasure to talk to him and learn from him. It was a salutary reminder of the quality of mind that chaos can steal. The greatest of us, the brightest, the most urbane and learned, can fall prey. One day, in the 10th week, I entered the chamber with Bequin and Amos as usual, and we woke him. But an uncommon sensation troubled me. "What is this?" I said. It seemed to me the casket was not quite in the same place as usual. "Have you been in here, Amos?" I asked. "Even to make standard checks?" "No," he assured me. The hold was locked as a matter of course after each session. My imagination, then, I decided. Our discourses continued, pleasantly, each morning for an hour or so. We often discussed imperial policies and ethics, subjects on which he was astonishingly well read. He never strayed, never allowed himself to profess a belief or concept that might be deemed counter to the strictures of the Imperium, as if he recognized that such an admission would perforce end our entente. On occasions I gave him openings to do so, conversational gambits that would allow him space and opportunity to criticize or denounce the way of the God Emperor and the rule of terror. He resisted, though at times I felt he was desperate to voice his own contrary beliefs. But his need for activity and contact was paramount. He would not risk losing our interaction. He could quote extensively chapter and verse from imperial texts, philosophies, poetry, ecclesiastical law. His scholarship rivaled Amos's, but just as he refrained from condemning himself with heretical utterances, he also refrained from actually professing loyalty to the Golden Throne. He conducted our conversations in a subjective, uninvolved way. He did not attempt to dissemble and play the part of the loyal citizen. I appreciated that this represented his respect for me. He did not insult my intelligence by lying. More often still than politics and ethics, we talked of history. Again, in this area, his learning was tremendous, but there was also, for the first time, an eagerness, a hunger. He never asked directly, but it was clear he longed to know in detail about the events that had taken place in the 212 years since his death. His family had clearly told him little. He made leading remarks to draw answers out of me. I gave him some, and sometimes volunteered accounts of major events, political changes, and imperial gains. I had decided beforehand not to make any mention of imperial defeats or losses, to avoid giving him anything he might relish. The picture that Pontius Glor got from me was of an Imperium stronger and more healthy than ever before. Even so, it delighted him. Precious glimpses of a galaxy he had long been divorced from. The rest of that long transit time was spent in preparation and study, daily regimes of weapons practice and combat training. Fischig ran hand-to-hand sessions each afternoon and set himself to honing Bequin's natural dexterity and speed. I pressed weights in a makeshift gymnasium and ran tens of kilometers each day around the empty halls and corridors of the SN. Slowly, I brought myself back to peak fitness. I worked my mind, too. A disciplined regime of psychic exercises, some conducted with Lowink's help. Amos and I studied extensively. We worked through all the archive data we had to hand, researching the Ceruthi. It added little to our knowledge. The extent of their territories was known, but virtually nothing beyond that. There had only been a handful of officially recorded contacts in the past 2,000 years. I wondered how much was known about them by the rogue traders who sailed beyond the Imperial Veil, men like Gorgone Locke. All we knew with any certainty was that the Ceruthi were an old Xenos culture, insular, secretive, lying outside the bounds of the Imperium. They were technically resourceful, mature and well-established. We knew nothing of their culture type, beliefs, language, not even their physical appearance. "We can at least conjecture they have some religious beliefs or values," Amos told me. "Or, at the very least, they hold certain relics of their past in high regard for some symbolic or sacred purpose. Our foes only excavated that material on Damask because they knew it had value to the Ceruthi." "Holy items? Icons?" He shrugged. "Or ancestor spirits, or simply a desire to recover and repatriate cultural materials from their past."
"And we know their territory was once bigger, extending as far as Damask, even if that was but a distant outpost," said Lowink. We sat around an inlaid table in one of Maxilla's staterooms, the polished tabletop smothered in open books, scrolls, data slates, and record tiles. "And Bonaventure," I said. "The Wheelgraves."
Bequin remarked that the sight at North Quan reminded her of those on her birth world. "Perhaps," said Amos, "but I am no archaeo-xenon expert. The wheel graves of Bonaventure are classified as of unknown Xenos manufacture in all the texts I can find. They are but one among hundreds of unidentified relic sites in the Helican subsector, all traces of a long-vanished, or at least long-shrunk, Ceruthi civilization, or the remnants of many miscellaneous forerunner species that roamed this part of space before man ever came this way." I set down a data slate and picked up the item that lay in the center of the table, wrapped in felt. It was the single ancient tablet that had escaped Damask with us. I had taken it from the crate during the standoff, and it had still been in my hand when we had thrown ourselves aboard the gun cutter. Like the stonework dugout in the Flame Hill mine, it was made of a hard, pale material, glittering with flecks of mica, and it was octagonal, but not regularly so, being peculiarly long on two edges. The back of it was burned and scored where it had been cut away. The reverse showed a bas-relief symbol, a 5-pointed star sigil, but it too was irregular. The radiating spars of the star were of unmatched length, and they protruded at a variety of angles. "Most perturbatory," said Amos, looking at it for the umpteenth time. "Symmetry, at least, basic symmetry, is a virtual constant in the galaxy. All species, even the most obscene Xenos kinds like the Tyrannid, have some order of it."
"There's something wrong with the angles,"
agreed Loink, furrowing his unhealthy, socket-pocked brow. I knew what he meant. It was as if the angles in the star symbol made up more than 360 degrees, though that, of course, was unthinkable. "Who has been in here?" I asked at the start of my next session with Pontius.